You are about to understand something that most people spend their entire lives confused about. By the time this ends, you will know how power works, who holds it, why they hold it, and most importantly, how ordinary people like you have changed the course of history forever. You will never look at a news headline the same way again. You will never sit in a conversation about government and feel lost. You will understand the game, the players, the rules, and the hidden moves that nobody talks about. This is not a lecture. This is the truth about politics, told the way it was always meant to be told, clearly, honestly, and without fear. Part 1. What politics actually is. Let us begin at the very beginning, because most people get this wrong from the start. Politics is not what happens on television. It is not the shouting matches between leaders. It is not the elections, the rallies, the flags, or the speeches. Those are symptoms. Politics is something far more ancient, far more human, and far more personal than any of that. Politics is the answer to one simple question. Who decides? That is it. That is the whole game. Who decides what the rules are? Who decides who gets what? Who decides who is protected and who is left out? Who decides which roads get built and which communities get forgotten? Who decides when a country goes to war and when it chooses peace? Everything in politics, every law, every election, every revolution, every protest, every speech, every deal made in a back room where no cameras are allowed, comes back to that single question. Who decides? Now, the reason politics feels complicated is because the answer to that question is never simple, and it is never permanent. Throughout history, different societies have given very different answers. Sometimes, one person decided everything. Sometimes, a small group of powerful families decided. Sometimes, priests decided because they claimed to speak for God. Sometimes, soldiers decided because they had the most weapons. And sometimes, in the most remarkable chapters of human history, ordinary people decided together. Each of these arrangements created a completely different kind of society. The rules of life under a king are completely different from the rules of life under a democracy. The rules under a religious government are completely different from the rules under a military dictatorship. And understanding those differences, truly understanding them deep in your bones, is the first step to understanding everything else. So let us go back, way back, to the very beginning of organized human power. Part 2. The birth of power. Tens of thousands of years ago, human beings lived in small groups, tribes, bands of hunters and gatherers who moved with the seasons, following animals and edible plants. In these groups, leadership existed, but it was nothing like what we know today. The leader was usually the best hunter, the wisest elder, or the person who could resolve conflicts within the group. Their power came from respect, from skill, from trust, and it was not permanent. If a leader made too many bad decisions, the group simply stopped following them. This kind of leadership was intimate and personal. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone depended on everyone. The checks on power were built into the fabric of daily life. But then, something changed everything. Agriculture. Around 12,000 years ago, human beings figured out how to grow food instead of just finding it. This seems like a small thing, but it was the most revolutionary development in all of human history, not because it gave people food, but because it gave people surplus. When you grow more food than you can eat, you need somewhere to store it. When you have stored food, you can survive the winter without moving. When you can survive without moving, you build permanent settlements. When settlements grow large enough, they become villages. Villages become towns. Towns become cities. Cities become empires. And here is where politics truly begins. Because the moment you have surplus, you have something that needs to be protected and distributed. And the moment you have something that needs to be protected and distributed, someone has to be in charge of that. Someone has to decide who gets how much, who guards the storehouse, who has the right to take from it, and who does not. The first governments in human history were essentially storage management systems. They were bureaucracies built around grain. The great river civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia, the fertile lands between two rivers, developed some of the earliest known written laws precisely because they needed to keep track of who owned what, who owed what, and who had the right to decide disputes. Power consolidated rapidly in these early societies. The person who controlled the food supply controlled everything. And controlling the food supply required organization, which required administrators, which required loyalty, which required rewards for loyalty, which required even more control over resources. Power fed itself. It grew. It became self-sustaining. And it did not take long before the people at the center of that power started to look very different from the people at the edges. Part 3. Kings, Gods, and the First Political Lie. The most powerful political invention in all of human history was not the sword. It was not the wall. It was not even the law. The most powerful political invention was the idea that some people were simply born to rule. Think about what this idea accomplished. If you are a king and your power rests only on your army, then you are always one military defeat away from losing everything. But if your people believe that you were chosen by God, that you carry divine blood, that your right to rule is written into the fabric of the universe itself, then your power is almost impossible to challenge. Because to challenge you is not just to challenge a human being, it is to challenge God. And who would dare do that? This idea that rulers derive their legitimacy from something beyond human questioning was one of the first and most enduring political tools ever created. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a king. He was a god. Or at least, he was treated as one. The entire political and religious structure of Egyptian society was designed to make this belief feel natural, inevitable, and true. In Mesopotamia, kings claimed to be the chosen servants of the gods. In China, rulers governed under what was called the mandate of heaven. In medieval Europe, kings claimed the divine right, the idea that God had personally chosen them to rule. The specific theology varied, but the political function was identical: to make power feel sacred, to make obedience feel like piety, to make questioning the ruler feel like a sin. And this was not just cynical manipulation, though it was certainly that too. It was also a genuine reflection of how people understood the world. In a time when lightning was unexplained, when disease killed randomly, when floods destroyed harvests with no warning, the idea that powerful forces beyond human understanding were shaping events felt obvious. The link between earthly kings and heavenly power made a kind of intuitive sense to people who saw the supernatural in everything. But here is what is remarkable. From the very beginning, there were also voices pushing back. There were thinkers who asked uncomfortable questions. There were ordinary people who noticed, sometimes at great personal risk, that the person claiming to speak for God seemed to be doing very well for themselves, while everyone else went hungry. The political tension between rulers and the ruled, between those who claim the right to decide and those who live under those decisions, is as old as civilization itself. Part 4. The Greek Experiment. Around 500 years before the Common Era, something extraordinary happened in a collection of small city-states on the rocky peninsula we now call Greece. People began to experiment with radical new ideas about who should govern and why. The ancient Greeks were not the first people to question power, but they were perhaps the first to do so systematically, philosophically, and in a way that produced written records that would influence every political thinker who came after them. The city of Athens became the laboratory for the most controversial political experiment of the ancient world: democracy, rule by the people. The word itself comes from Greek: demos, meaning the people; kratos, meaning power or rule. Power of the people. Now, It is important to understand what Athenian democracy actually looked like, because it was very different from what most people today think of when they hear the word democracy. It was not a system where everyone voted for representatives who then made decisions on their behalf. It was something more direct, and in some ways, more radical. Citizens gathered in a large open-air assembly and voted directly on laws and decisions. There were no professional politicians in the modern sense. Ordinary citizens were expected to participate in governance as a civic duty. But here is the crucial catch. Not everyone was a citizen. Women were excluded entirely. Enslaved people, who made up a substantial portion of the population, had no political rights whatsoever. Foreign residents, even those who had lived in Athens for generations, were not citizens. So the democracy was real, but it was a democracy for a minority. The majority of people living in Athens had no voice in its governance. This is something that runs through political history like a thread that never quite disappears. Almost every expansion of democracy in history has been incomplete. Every time power is distributed more widely, there is always someone left out. And the history of politics is very often the history of those left out people demanding to be included. The Greeks also gave us some of the first serious political philosophy. Plato wrote about the ideal state, arguing, controversially, that philosophers were best suited to govern because they valued wisdom above personal gain. His student Aristotle took a more practical approach, classifying different types of government and analyzing the conditions under which each thrives or fails. These thinkers were asking questions that we are still arguing about today. What makes a government legitimate? What obligations does a ruler have to the people? What happens when a government becomes corrupt? Is democracy always the best system, or are there circumstances where it fails? Part 5. Rome, Republics, and the Anatomy of Political Collapse. From Greece, the story of politics moves to Rome. And Rome is one of the most important political case studies in all of human history, not because it was perfect, but because it demonstrated, with extraordinary clarity, exactly how political systems rise, succeed, become corrupted, and collapse. Rome began as a kingdom, then became a republic, then became an empire. That arc, from one form of government to another, driven by internal pressures, power struggles, and popular discontent, is something that has repeated itself in many variations throughout history. The Roman Republic was a genuinely sophisticated political system. It had a Senate composed of aristocratic families. It had elected magistrates who served limited terms. It had a system of checks and balances designed to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power. Two consuls served as co-chief executives, each able to veto the other. The system was built around the idea that shared power was safer than concentrated power. And for several centuries, it worked remarkably well. Rome grew from a small city to the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. Trade flourished. Roads were built. Law was codified. The idea of being a Roman citizen, of having certain rights and protections under Roman law, was genuinely meaningful. But the Republic carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. And those seeds were inequality. As Rome conquered more territory, the wealth from those conquests flowed primarily to the aristocratic class. Roman senators and wealthy families accumulated enormous landholdings, often worked by enslaved people captured in war. Small farmers, who had often served in the army that won those conquests, returned home to find that they could not compete. They lost their land. They drifted to the cities. They became poor urban residents, dependent on cheap grain distributions. The political system, designed for a society of roughly equal citizen farmers, began to crack under the pressure of extreme inequality. Demagogues arose. Politicians who knew how to appeal to the frustrations of the poor used populist rhetoric to build personal power bases. Violence entered politics. Serious reform efforts were met with assassination. The social contract that held the republic together frayed and then broke. Into this vacuum stepped a series of military strongmen, generals who commanded the loyalty of their soldiers personally rather than institutionally. Julius Caesar was the most famous of these, and his assassination in 44 years before the Common Era was a last desperate attempt by the old guard to save the republic. It failed. The republic never recovered. Within a generation, Caesar's adopted son, Augustus, had consolidated power so thoroughly that Rome became, in practice, an empire, even as it maintained many of the old republican forms and titles. The lesson Rome offers is not that republics are doomed. The lesson is that political institutions, no matter how cleverly designed, do not protect themselves. They require citizens who believe in them, who are willing to defend them, and who hold their leaders accountable. When a society becomes too unequal, when too many people feel that the system does not work for them, the institutions that hold that system together become vulnerable to those who promise simple answers to complicated problems. Part 6. The Middle Ages and the Politics of God. After the fall of Rome in the West, Europe entered a period of dramatic political fragmentation. The centralized power of the empire dissolved. In its place arose a patchwork of kingdoms, lordships, and fiefdoms, each with its own local ruler, its own customs, its own system of loyalty and obligation. This period, which historians call the Middle Ages, lasting roughly from the 5th century to the 15th century, produced a distinctive political system called feudalism. Feudalism was essentially a pyramid of personal loyalties. A king granted land to nobles in exchange for military service. Those nobles granted smaller parcels to lesser lords in exchange for loyalty and more military service. At the very bottom of the pyramid were the serfs, peasant farmers who were bound to the land, owing labor and a portion of their crops to the lord above them. They had almost no political rights. They had almost no ability to move, to refuse, or to resist. Political power in this system was intensely personal and local. What mattered was not abstract citizenship or constitutional rights, but personal relationships of loyalty, obligation, and protection. Your lord protected you from raiders. You worked his fields and followed him to war. The deal was brutal, unequal, and all but inescapable. But in a world where violence was constant and law was inconsistent, it offered something that people needed desperately: a degree of predictability. Alongside the feudal structure ran another immense power: the Catholic Church. In medieval Europe, the Church was not merely a religious institution, it was a political superpower. It controlled vast landholdings. It ran the educational system. It administered charitable functions. Its priests and bishops were often the only literate people in a given region. And most powerfully, it claimed authority over the spiritual lives of every Christian, which in practice meant everyone. The Pope, as the head of the Church, could excommunicate kings. Excommunication meant being cut off from the sacraments, from the community of Christians, and in the understanding of the time, from salvation itself. A king who was excommunicated might find that his nobles felt released from their oaths of loyalty. His authority became spiritually illegitimate. This was not merely a symbolic threat, it was a genuine political weapon of enormous power. The struggle between secular rulers and the Church for ultimate authority ran through medieval politics for centuries. It was not just a theological dispute, it was a fight over who decided, the fundamental question of politics. Did the Pope have the right to crown and uncrown kings? Did kings have the right to appoint bishops in their territories? These questions, which might sound obscure today, were matters of life, death, war, and peace in the medieval world. Part 7. Renaissance, Reformation, and the cracks in old power. Beginning in the 14th century, something began to shift. The Renaissance, starting in the Italian city-states, brought a renewed interest in the classical world of Greece and Rome. Scholars rediscovered ancient texts, artists began to paint human beings with a new sense of individual dignity and importance. Thinkers started to ask old questions with new urgency. Then came the invention that changed everything again: the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg's development of movable type in the mid-15th century was not just a technological achievement, it was a political earthquake. Before the printing press, information was scarce, expensive, and controlled. Books were copied by hand, mostly by monks, and were owned primarily by the church and the aristocracy. Most people could not read, partly because books were nearly impossible to obtain. The printing press changed the economics of information overnight. Books became cheaper, literacy began to spread, and most dangerously, for established power, ideas could now travel faster than any authority could suppress them. The first great demonstration of the printing press as a political weapon came with the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther nailed his criticisms of church practice to a church door in Wittenberg in 1517, his arguments would normally have circulated slowly, been quietly suppressed, and perhaps led to his quiet elimination. Instead, his ideas were printed and distributed across Europe with astonishing speed. Within weeks, people across the continent were reading and debating arguments that directly challenged the authority of the most powerful institution in the Western world. The Reformation shattered the political unity of Christian Europe. Where once the Pope had been the ultimate spiritual and in many ways political authority over all of Western Christendom, now there were competing Christian denominations, each with different ideas about authority, scripture, and governance. Protestant princes in Northern Europe broke with Rome. Wars were fought. Thousands died. The political map of Europe was redrawn along religious lines. But beyond the specific religious questions, the Reformation introduced something politically revolutionary: the idea that individuals could read and interpret foundational texts for themselves, that they did not need an official intermediary to tell them what truth meant, that private conscience had a kind of authority that external institutions must respect. This idea, once planted, grew far beyond religion. It eventually became one of the foundational arguments for political rights, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, and ultimately, democracy. Part 8. The Philosophy of Freedom. The 17th century was one of the most philosophically productive periods in political history. Thinkers across Europe were wrestling with some of the most fundamental questions anyone can ask. Where does political authority come from? What gives a government the right to make laws and demand obedience? What happens when a government betrays its people? And do individuals have rights that no government can legitimately take away? Thomas Hobbes, writing during the chaos of the English Civil War, argued that without government, human life would be, in his famous phrase, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. People in a state of nature, with no authority to enforce rules, would be in a constant war of everyone against everyone. To escape this nightmare, people rationally surrendered most of their freedom to a sovereign authority, a monarch or government, in exchange for protection and order. Hobbes called this agreement the social contract. Crucially, for Hobbes, once you made this deal, you were stuck with it. There was no right of rebellion, because the alternative to any government, however bad, was the even worse state of nature. John Locke looked at essentially the same question and reached a very different conclusion. Locke argued that people are born with natural rights: life, liberty, and property. These rights exist prior to government and cannot be legitimately taken away. When people form governments, they do so to protect these rights, not to surrender them. And this is the crucial difference from Hobbes. If a government systematically violates the natural rights of its people, the people have not just a right, but a duty to replace it with a better one. Locke's ideas were electrifying. They provided a philosophical foundation, not just for limited government, but for revolution. The right of a people to overthrow a tyrannical government was no longer just a desperate act of self-preservation. It was a rational conclusion from first principles about the nature of rights and the purpose of government. Then came Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who added another layer entirely. Rousseau argued that civilization itself had corrupted human beings. In a natural state, people were essentially good. It was inequality, property, and the social structures that protected inequality that made people competitive, cruel, and miserable. For Rousseau, legitimate government required the full consent of the governed, expressed through what he called the general will, the common good of the community as a whole. Government that served only the interests of the powerful rather than the community was not just bad government, it was illegitimate government. These three thinkers, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, essentially laid out the fundamental tensions in political thought that we still live with today. How much freedom should individuals surrender for order and security? What rights are so fundamental that no government can touch them? How do we distinguish legitimate authority from mere power? What does the common good actually mean, and who gets to define it? Part 9. Revolution. The ideas of Locke, Rousseau, and their contemporaries did not stay in books. They caught fire. In 1776, a collection of colonies on the eastern coast of a continent that had been colonized by European powers for roughly 2.5 centuries issued a document that changed the course of history. The Declaration stated that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that when a government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. This was Locke, translated into political action. These were not just philosophical arguments. They were a justification for revolution, written in plain and powerful language, addressed to a watching world. The revolution that followed created something genuinely new: a large-scale republic governed by elected representatives, operating under a written constitution with explicit protections for individual rights. It was imperfect from birth, most glaringly because it tolerated, and was in many ways, economically dependent on the enslavement of millions of Africans and their descendants, a fact that would tear the country apart less than a century later. But the framework it created, the idea that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, was a landmark in the history of political thought. Then, 13 years later, France exploded. The French Revolution was more radical, more violent, more philosophically ambitious, and ultimately more terrifying than what had happened before it across the ocean. The causes were a toxic combination of extreme inequality, a monarchy that had bankrupted itself through decades of war and extravagance, an aristocracy that was exempt from taxes while the poor starved, and a population that had been reading Enlightenment philosophy and was now deeply unwilling to pretend that this arrangement was natural or divinely ordained. The revolution began with demands for reform and ended with something far more radical. The king was executed. A republic was declared. And then, in the chaos of attempting to build an entirely new political order while being simultaneously attacked by neighboring monarchies who feared the revolutionary ideas spreading to their own populations, the revolution consumed itself. The Reign of Terror saw thousands of people guillotined, including many of the revolution's own leaders. And out of the chaos eventually emerged Napoleon, another military strongman who understood that in a moment of exhaustion and fear, people will trade revolutionary ideals for order and the promise of glory. The French Revolution terrified the aristocracies of Europe, but inspired the common people. It demonstrated, permanently, that even the most deeply entrenched ruling class was not safe if it pushed its people too far. It also demonstrated the danger of revolutionary purism, the way that ideological certainty about building a perfect new order could lead to violence, paranoia, and the same kind of concentrated power the revolution had set out to destroy. Part 10. The Industrial Revolution and the Politics of Class. While philosophers debated the nature of rights and revolutionaries overthrew monarchies, an entirely different transformation was reshaping the material conditions of human life. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in Britain in the late 18th century and spreading rapidly across the world throughout the 19th century, transformed how goods were made, where people lived, and how society was organized. Factories replaced workshops. Cities swelled as people moved from rural areas in search of wage labor. The pace of economic change was staggering. Wealth was created on a scale previously unimaginable, and that wealth was distributed in a way that created new and severe forms of inequality. Factory workers in the early Industrial Revolution worked under conditions that are almost impossible to imagine today. 14 and 16-hour workdays were common. Children worked in mines and mills. Workers had no legal protections, no right to organize, no recourse when injured or dismissed. The cities in which they lived were overcrowded, unsanitary, and dangerous. Life expectancy for the urban poor was brutally low. At the same time, the owners of factories, mines, and railroads were accumulating fortunes of unprecedented size. The gap between the wealthiest and the poorest was not just large, it was visible, daily, and increasingly resented. This created the conditions for the most significant new political ideology of the 19th century. Socialism, in its many forms, was a response to the obvious failure of industrial capitalism to distribute its benefits equitably. The core socialist argument was simple. The wealth created by workers should not flow primarily to the owners of capital. Workers should have a meaningful share in what they produce. Society should be organized to meet collective human needs rather than to maximize private profit. At the extreme end of this spectrum stood Karl Marx, whose analysis of capitalism as a system and whose argument for revolutionary change would become one of the most influential and contested political philosophies in history. Marx argued that all of politics was ultimately a reflection of economic relationships, that the state was not a neutral arbiter between competing interests, but an instrument of class power, used by those who owned the means of production to maintain their dominance over those who had nothing to sell but their labor. History, for Marx, was the story of class struggle, and it would end, he argued, with the working class overthrowing the capitalist system and creating a classless society. Marx was wrong about many things, including his predictions about exactly how and when revolution would come. But his identification of the deep connection between economic power and political power, his insistence that you cannot understand politics without understanding who owns what and who works for whom, that insight has proven remarkably durable. Part 11. Nationalism and the Danger of Belonging. Alongside the ideological conflicts between capitalism and socialism, the 19th century produced another political force that would shape the 20th century with catastrophic results. Nationalism. Nationalism is the idea that people who share a language, a culture, a history, or an ethnicity form a natural community, a nation, and that this natural community deserves its own political expression, its own state. On its face, this seems relatively benign. And in its early forms, nationalism was often linked to liberal ideas about self-determination and freedom from imperial domination. The desire of Poles, or Italians, or Greeks to govern themselves rather than being ruled by the Habsburg or Ottoman empires seems like a reasonable expression of the Lockean idea that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. But nationalism carries within it a dangerous tendency. The definition of the nation, who belongs and who does not, who is truly one of us, and who is an outsider or a threat, can be manipulated in ways that become extremely dangerous. Nationalist movements almost inevitably create insiders and outsiders. They draw lines between those who belong to the nation and those who, however long they have lived there, are deemed not truly part of it. Jews, Roma people, and other minorities across Europe discovered, often with lethal consequences, that the nation-state could be used not just to celebrate a common identity, but to exclude and persecute those deemed not to share it. This tendency reached its most extreme and horrifying expression in the 20th century, in the ideology and practices of fascism, and most particularly in the Nazi regime in Germany. The Holocaust was not an accident or an aberration. It was the logical endpoint of a politics built on the premise that the nation is an organic racial community whose purity must be protected at all costs, and that certain groups of people are by their very existence a threat to that community. Understanding the Holocaust is not just a moral obligation, it is a political education. It demonstrates what becomes possible when nationalism fuses with authoritarian politics, propaganda, economic desperation, and the dehumanization of minority groups. It demonstrates that ordinary people, people who thought of themselves as decent and civilized, are capable of participating in or tolerating extraordinary evil when the right psychological and political conditions are created. The political lesson is not that nationalism is always and inevitably fascist. It is that nationalism, like all political ideologies, can be used for liberation or for oppression, depending on how it is defined and who it excludes. Part 12. Democracy versus Dictatorship in the 20th Century. The 20th century was the most politically turbulent period in human history. 2 world wars, the rise and fall of fascism, the Cold War between capitalism and communism, the decolonization of Asia and Africa, the civil rights struggle, the end of apartheid, more political change, more political violence, and more political transformation happened in the 100 years of the 20th century than in perhaps any previous era. The great political contest of the 20th century was between democracy and its alternatives. Fascism was defeated militarily in the Second World War at a cost of tens of millions of lives. Communism, in its Soviet form, competed with Western liberal democracy for several decades before collapsing under the weight of its own inefficiencies, contradictions, and political repression. Democracy, despite all its imperfections, emerged from the 20th century as the dominant political model. And it is worth thinking carefully about why. Democracy, at its best, does several things that other systems have consistently failed to do. It creates a peaceful mechanism for transferring power. In a democracy, when the people are dissatisfied with their leaders, they can replace them through elections rather than through revolution or civil war. This is not a small thing. The ability to change governments without bloodshed is genuinely remarkable. Democracy also creates accountability. Leaders who must face voters periodically have incentives to respond to public preferences and to avoid the most blatant abuses of power. They are not perfectly accountable, not even close, but they are more accountable than leaders who face no such pressure. Democracy protects a space for opposition. In a healthy democracy, you can criticize the government, organize against it, argue for alternative policies, and work to replace it through legitimate means. This space, this protected sphere of political activity, is crucial not just for politics, but for intellectual and cultural life. Societies where dissent is permitted tend to be more innovative, more adaptive, and more honest about their own problems. But democracy also has deep vulnerabilities. It can be captured by money. When wealthy interests can spend enormous sums influencing elections and lobbying governments, the formal equality of one person, one vote can be hollowed out in practice. It can be manipulated by demagogues who understand how to exploit fear, resentment, and the desire for simple answers to complex problems. It can produce majorities that trample the rights of minorities, and it requires something that is not always present: an informed citizenry willing to do the hard work of participating in collective decision-making. Part 13. The Cold War and the Ideology Machine. After the Second World War, the world was divided between two superpowers with fundamentally different visions of how society should be organized. The United States and its allies represented one vision: free markets, political democracy, individual rights, and a more or less open international system. The Soviet Union and its bloc represented another: state ownership of the economy, a single ruling party, collective good over individual rights, and the belief that a communist society was a historical inevitability. This contest, the Cold War, lasted roughly 45 years, from the late 1940s to the early 1990s. It never became a direct military conflict between the two superpowers, partly because both sides possessed nuclear weapons, and the prospect of mutual assured destruction made direct war unthinkable. Instead, the Cold War was fought through proxy conflicts in other countries, through the arms race, through economic competition, through propaganda, through espionage, and through the contest for influence in the newly independent nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The Cold War shaped politics in ways that are still with us. It made ideology central to everything. Every political question, every conflict, every new government was filtered through the lens of the great superpower competition. Countries that tried to chart independent paths, neither fully aligned with Washington nor with Moscow, were often pressured, coerced, or destabilized by one or both sides. The Cold War also produced some of the most egregious examples of democratic hypocrisy in modern history. The United States, which proclaimed itself the champion of freedom and democracy, repeatedly supported or installed authoritarian governments in other countries when those governments were reliable anti-communist allies. Democratically elected leaders were overthrown. Brutal dictators were armed, trained, and protected, so long as they were the right kind of brutal dictator, the kind that kept their countries in the capitalist sphere of influence. This hypocrisy had long-lasting consequences. In many parts of the world, the word democracy came to be associated not with freedom and self-determination, but with foreign interference, with the overthrow of leaders who tried to prioritize their own people's needs over the preferences of powerful foreign interests. The resentment generated by these interventions did not disappear when the Cold War ended. It fed into the political currents of the late 20th and early 21st centuries in ways that are still playing out. Part 14: Decolonization and the Politics of the Global South. One of the most important political stories of the 20th century is one that receives far less attention than it deserves in mainstream political education: the story of decolonization. By the end of the 19th century, European powers had colonized the vast majority of Asia, Africa, and had previously colonized virtually all of the Americas. Colonialism was not just political control. It was economic extraction on a massive scale. Raw materials flowed from colonies to imperial powers. Local economies were restructured to serve the needs of the colonizers. Local political structures were dismantled or subordinated. Local cultures were denigrated and suppressed. And the people of colonized regions were told, in countless ways, both overt and subtle, that they were not capable of governing themselves. After the Second World War, the colonial order began to crack. The war had weakened European powers economically and morally. The ideology of freedom and self-determination that the Allies had used to justify the war against fascism made it increasingly difficult to defend the continued subordination of half the world. And liberation movements across Asia and Africa were growing in strength, sophistication, and determination. The decolonization of Asia and Africa, primarily in the 1950s and 60s, was one of the most rapid political transformations in history. Dozens of new countries came into existence within 2 decades. Each faced the challenge of building political institutions, economies, and national identities, often from scratch, in the aftermath of colonial extraction and deliberate underdevelopment, with borders that were drawn not by the people who lived there, but by European powers for European purposes. The political outcomes varied enormously. Some newly independent countries established relatively stable democracies. Others fell into civil wars, dictatorships, or what political scientists call state failure, the collapse of functioning government entirely. Some found themselves immediately entangled in Cold War competition, with both superpowers eager to secure their allegiance. The legacy of colonialism is not simply historical, it is present. The economic inequalities between the former colonizing countries and the former colonized countries are still striking. The political instabilities that were in many cases directly caused or exacerbated by colonial policies continue to produce suffering, and the political narratives through which people understand their own countries and the world around them are still deeply shaped by the colonial experience. Part 15. The Politics of Identity. From the 1960s onward, political life in many countries underwent another transformation. Alongside the old questions of class and economic distribution, new political movements organized around what we now call identity. Race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, and disability became sites of political struggle. The civil rights movement in the mid-20th century was perhaps the most powerful example. Generations of Black citizens had been systematically excluded from the full rights of democratic citizenship through a combination of legal discrimination, economic exclusion, political disenfranchisement, and racial terror. The movement that emerged to challenge this was not just a moral crusade, it was a sophisticated political operation that deployed legal challenges, civil disobedience, economic boycotts, and eventually electoral politics to force a confrontation with the contradiction between the proclaimed ideals of democracy and the reality of racial apartheid. The women's movement, which had deep roots going back to the 19th century suffrage struggle, surged again in the 1960s and 70s. Women challenged not just the lack of formal legal equality, but the deeper ways in which political and social institutions were structured to serve male interests and ignore female experience. The insight that the personal is political, that what happens in families and bedrooms and workplaces is not private and apolitical, but deeply shaped by power structures that politics can change, was one of the most important conceptual contributions of feminist thought. The LGBTQ movement, the disability rights movement, movements for indigenous rights, each emerged from a similar recognition that formal legal equality, the right to vote, the absence of explicitly discriminatory laws was not sufficient, that the lived experience of discrimination, marginalization, and exclusion from full participation in social and political life was itself a political problem that required political solutions. These identity-based movements enriched and complicated politics in important ways. They made visible forms of power and oppression that had previously been treated as natural or private. They expanded the coalition of people who felt that the existing order failed to represent their interests. They produced new theories of justice and new arguments about what a fair and equal society would actually look like. They also generated backlash. The expansion of who counts, of whose experience matters, of whose rights must be protected, has been met in every era by resistance from those who feel that the expansion comes at their expense, or who feel that the old order and its certainties are being taken from them. Part 16. Media, Information, and Political Reality. Politics has always depended on communication. Who controls the story controls power. This has been true since the first priests told the first stories about divine kings. It was true when the church controlled the only books. It was true when the printing press democratized information. And it is true today, in ways that are both more powerful and more dangerous than anything that came before. For much of the 20th century, mass communication was dominated by a relatively small number of institutions. Newspapers, radio stations, and eventually television networks reached millions of people, but were owned by a manageable number of organizations and operated under regulatory frameworks that created at least some pressure toward accuracy and public service. The internet changed all of that. The barriers to distributing information dropped essentially to zero. Anyone with a phone and an internet connection could reach a potential global audience. This was, in many ways, enormously liberating. Voices that had been excluded from mainstream media could now be heard. Governments and powerful institutions could be scrutinized and challenged in new ways. Movements could organize across geographic boundaries. But the same technology that empowered marginalized voices also enabled the unprecedented spread of misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. The economic model of most internet platforms rewards content that provokes strong emotional reactions, because outrage and fear keep people engaged longer than nuance and complexity. Algorithms designed to maximize engagement have, in many cases, consistently steered users toward more extreme content, because extreme content tends to provoke more reactions. The result has been a profound transformation in political information environments. People in many countries now live in what commentators call filter bubbles or information silos, absorbing primarily information that confirms what they already believe, from sources that reinforce their existing worldview, encountering the opposing view only in its most distorted and hostile form. This has made democratic politics harder. Not impossible, but harder. When people cannot agree on basic facts, when the concept of objective reality is itself contested, when every institution that might serve as a common reference point, mainstream media, universities, government agencies, scientific bodies, is trusted by only a portion of the population, the kind of deliberation and compromise that democracy requires becomes genuinely difficult. Part 17. The Architecture of Modern Government. Let us pause here and look carefully at how modern governments are actually structured, because understanding the theory and history of politics is important, but so is understanding the mechanics. Modern democratic governments, in most of their forms, operate through a separation of powers. The idea, drawing heavily on the work of the philosopher Montesquieu, is that concentrating all power in one place creates tyranny. The solution is to divide power among different institutions, each with the ability to check and limit the others. In most democracies, there are three main branches: the legislative branch, which makes laws; the executive branch, which implements and administers laws; and the judicial branch, which interprets laws and adjudicates disputes. The legislative branch, whether it is called a parliament, a congress, an assembly, or some other name, consists of elected representatives who debate and vote on legislation. In many countries, the legislature is divided into two chambers, an upper and a lower house, each with different compositions and sometimes different powers. This bicameralism creates additional complexity and additional opportunities for checking hasty or ill-considered legislation. The executive branch, headed by a president, prime minister, or chancellor, depending on the system, is responsible for carrying out the laws passed by the legislature, managing the day-to-day functions of government, and representing the country in international affairs. The relationship between the executive and the legislature varies significantly between different systems. In a parliamentary system, like those of the United Kingdom or Canada or Germany, the executive is drawn from the legislature and depends on its continued confidence. In a presidential system, like that of the United States or most of Latin America, the executive is elected separately and serves a fixed term regardless of legislative support. The judicial branch interprets the law in specific cases and, in many countries, has the power to strike down laws that violate the Constitution. This power of judicial review, which allows unelected judges to override the decisions of elected legislatures, is one of the most controversial aspects of modern democratic governance. Supporters argue that it protects fundamental rights from majoritarian tyranny. Critics argue that it gives excessive power to unelected officials and undermines democratic self-governance. Below the national level, most countries have layers of regional and local government. States, provinces, regions, municipalities, and counties each have their own powers and responsibilities. The distribution of power between national and subnational governments is called federalism, where it is formalized constitutionally, and it creates its own rich set of political questions about which level of government is best suited to make which kinds of decisions. Part 18. Political parties and electoral systems. In practice, most democratic politics runs through political parties. Parties are organized groups of people who share, or at least claim to share, a set of political beliefs and who organize collectively to win elections and exercise power. Political parties serve several important functions in a democracy. They aggregate the preferences of many individual voters into coherent platforms. They recruit and train political leaders. They organize electoral campaigns. They provide the basis for legislative coalitions. And they give voters a manageable way to choose between competing visions of governance without having to evaluate every candidate on every issue from scratch. But parties also have significant downsides. They can prioritize their own organizational interests over the interests of the people they claim to serve. They can enforce internal discipline in ways that prevent individual elected officials from acting on their genuine convictions. They can become vehicles for factional power struggles that have nothing to do with the public good. And in polarized environments, they can encourage their members to view the opposing party not just as political rivals, but as enemies. The way elections are structured has an enormous effect on the shape of the party system and on political representation more broadly. In plurality systems, sometimes called first-past-the-post systems, the candidate with the most votes in a given district wins, regardless of whether they have achieved a majority. This system tends to produce two dominant parties because votes for smaller parties are essentially wasted, and voters who prefer a smaller party often feel pressured to vote for whichever major party they dislike less. Proportional representation systems, by contrast, allocate legislative seats in proportion to the share of the vote each party receives. This allows a wider range of parties to gain representation and tends to produce coalition governments, where two or more parties must work together to form a governing majority. This can produce more representative governments, but it can also produce instability and difficulty forming durable governing coalitions. Neither system is simply better. Both have genuine advantages and genuine drawbacks. The choice between them reflects different priorities about representation, stability, and accountability. Part 19. International politics and the system of states. Politics does not stop at national borders. The interactions between states, the system of international relations, is itself a political domain with its own history, its own logic, and its own power structures. The modern international system is built on the principle of sovereignty. Each state has exclusive authority over its own territory and is recognized by other states as having that authority. This system of mutual recognition and non-interference in internal affairs emerged gradually in Europe over several centuries and was formally codified after the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. The sovereignty principle has been enormously valuable. It created a framework for international coexistence that, however imperfect, has allowed a world of enormous diversity, different cultures, different political systems, different religious traditions, to coexist without constant war of all against all. It protects smaller and weaker states from the most naked forms of domination by larger and stronger ones, at least in principle. But sovereignty also has a dark side. It can be used to shield governments from accountability for how they treat their own people. The argument that what happens inside a country's borders is nobody else's business has been used to protect dictators, to prevent international intervention in genocides, and to insulate the worst abusers of human rights from outside pressure. The tension between sovereignty and human rights, between the principle of non-interference and the principle that certain things governments do to their people, are so wrong that the international community has a responsibility to act, is one of the central, unresolved tensions in contemporary international politics. Above and alongside the system of sovereign states has developed a web of international institutions. The United Nations, created after the Second World War to prevent another global conflict, provides a forum for international discussion and has a range of agencies that address global problems, from health to refugees to development. International trade organizations set the rules for the global economy. International courts adjudicate disputes and, sometimes, hold individuals accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Regional organizations, like the European Union, have in some cases gone much further, creating genuine supranational institutions with real authority over member states. None of these institutions is as powerful as states would like to pretend in public, or as weak as they sometimes claim in private. They are real, but limited expressions of the fact that many of the most important problems human beings face, climate change, pandemic disease, nuclear proliferation, international terrorism, poverty, do not respect national borders and cannot be solved by any single country acting alone. Part 20. The Politics of Economics. It is impossible to understand modern politics without understanding the relationship between politics and economics. The two are inseparable, whatever some economic textbooks might suggest. The basic economic question that politics must answer is, how should resources, goods, services, and opportunities be produced and distributed? Different answers to this question produce radically different societies. At one end of the spectrum, pure capitalism imagines a world in which all economic decisions are made by private individuals and organizations through markets, with minimal government interference. Prices signal where resources should go. Competition drives efficiency and innovation. The result, in theory, is the most productive possible allocation of resources and a rising standard of living for everyone. At the other end, central planning imagines a world in which the government makes the major economic decisions about what to produce, how to produce it, and how to distribute it, based on collective need rather than individual profit. The result, in theory, is an economy organized to serve human needs rather than to generate private wealth. In practice, every real economy sits somewhere between these poles. No economy is purely capitalist, because markets fail in well-documented ways, and even the most market-oriented governments provide essential services, regulate dangerous activities, and maintain the legal framework without which markets cannot function. And no economy is purely centrally planned, because the information problem, the challenge of gathering and processing the knowledge needed to make good economic decisions for millions of people, has proven to be practically insuperable for central planners. The political debate is therefore not really between capitalism and socialism in their pure theoretical forms. It is about where on the spectrum a particular society should sit. How much should be left to markets? How much should be regulated? What should be provided publicly? How should the benefits of economic growth be distributed? How much inequality is acceptable before it undermines social cohesion and democratic politics? These questions do not have simple technical answers. They are fundamentally value questions about what kind of society we want to live in, what we owe each other, and what we are willing to sacrifice for the collective good. And because they are value questions, they are inherently political. Part 21. Power, Corruption, and Why Good Intentions Are Not Enough. By now, you have traveled through thousands of years of political history. You have seen empires rise and fall. You have seen revolutions that promised liberation and delivered tyranny. You have seen democratic experiments that thrived and democratic experiments that collapsed. And one pattern runs through all of it. Power corrupts. This is not just a cliché. It is one of the most robustly documented findings in political psychology and history. People who hold power over others tend, over time, to become less empathetic toward those they govern, more confident in their own judgment, more willing to use coercive means to achieve their goals, and more resistant to information that challenges their self-image or threatens their position. This happens not because political leaders are uniquely bad people. Most political leaders begin with some mixture of genuine idealism, ambition, and desire to do good. The corruption of power is structural. It is built into the situation of holding power itself. When you are surrounded by people who need your approval and approval to advance their careers, you stop hearing honest feedback. When you have the ability to silence or punish critics, the incentive to do so is constant. When you have been making decisions that affect millions of people, it becomes genuinely difficult to maintain the humility necessary to recognize that you might be wrong. When you believe deeply in your own vision for society, the temptation to override inconvenient democratic constraints in service of that vision can become overwhelming. This is why the structural features of democratic government, the separation of powers, the requirement for regular elections, the protection of free speech and a free press, the independence of the judiciary, are not bureaucratic inconveniences or quaint historical traditions. They are carefully engineered mechanisms for containing the very human tendency of those who hold power to abuse it. The tragedy of many failed democracies is not that they were destroyed by obviously evil people. It is that they were undermined by people who genuinely believed they were doing the right thing, who felt that the messy compromises and constraints of democratic governance were obstacles to the great good they could accomplish if only they were free to act decisively. Every authoritarian in history has believed they were acting for a higher purpose. Almost none have achieved it. Part 22. The Future of Politics. We have arrived at the present moment, which is also the beginning of the future, and the political challenges ahead are as daunting as any humanity has faced. Climate change is the most immediate and severe. The scientific consensus is overwhelming that human activity is warming the planet in ways that will, if unchecked, produce catastrophic consequences for billions of people. The political challenge is that addressing climate change requires sustained collective action across national boundaries, over time, horizons that exceed normal electoral cycles, involving costs that fall unevenly across different groups and different countries. It requires the most sophisticated and cooperative kind of political decision-making, exactly the kind that is hardest to achieve. Artificial intelligence is reshaping economics, warfare, and information in ways that raise profound political questions. As algorithms make more decisions that affect people's lives, who is accountable? As AI-generated content makes it harder to distinguish real from fabricated, how does democratic deliberation function? As AI transforms labor markets, how do societies manage the displacement and distribute the gains? As AI enhances the surveillance capabilities of governments, how are civil liberties protected? Inequality is at levels not seen in a century in many countries, and the political effects of that inequality are already visible. Concentrated wealth translates into concentrated political influence. People who feel economically left behind are more susceptible to demagogues who offer simple explanations and simple enemies. The social trust that democratic politics requires is hard to sustain in a society where different groups live in effectively different economic realities. The crisis of trust in institutions is real and deep. Governments, media, universities, courts, scientific bodies, religious institutions, all have experienced significant declines in public trust over recent decades. Some of that decline reflects genuine failures by those institutions. Some reflect successful campaigns to deliberately undermine trust in inconvenient truth-tellers. Disentangling which is which and rebuilding warranted trust where it has been lost is one of the most urgent political challenges of our time. Democratic backsliding, the erosion of democratic norms and institutions by leaders who were themselves elected democratically, is happening in multiple countries simultaneously. The mechanisms are often similar. Attacks on judicial independence, pressures on free media, manipulation of electoral rules, the delegitimization of political opponents as enemies rather than rivals. These trends are a reminder that democracy is not a permanent achievement, but a continuous practice that requires active maintenance. Part 23. What Politics Asks of You. We are near the end now, and it would be wrong to conclude without addressing the most personal question that politics raises. What does all of this mean for you, the person listening? Politics is not a spectator sport. It is not something that happens to you. It is something you participate in, whether you are aware of it or not. If you vote, you participate. If you do not vote, you participate by your absence. If you pay taxes, you participate. If you read and share information, you participate. If you talk to your neighbors, your colleagues, your family about the issues of the day, you participate. The question is not whether to participate in politics. The question is how to participate, and with what degree of awareness and intentionality. The history we have covered together suggests some principles that seem to hold up across time and context. Power needs to be checked. Whether the power is held by a king, a president, a corporation, a political party, or a social movement, concentrated and unchecked power almost always leads to abuse. The mechanisms for checking power, whether through law, through elections, through free press, through civil society, through the simple willingness of citizens to pay attention and speak up, are not optional extras. They are the essential infrastructure of a just society. Rights matter, and they are never secure forever. The rights that people take for granted today were fought for, sometimes at great cost, by previous generations. They can be taken away, usually not all at once, usually through a gradual process of normalization and incremental erosion. Vigilance is not paranoia. It is the appropriate response to the historical record. Economics and politics are inseparable. Who gets what in a society is a political question, not just an economic one. Policies that concentrate wealth and economic opportunity also concentrate political power, which in turn protects and extends that concentration of wealth. This feedback loop does not resolve itself automatically. It requires political will to interrupt it. Inclusion makes democracy stronger. Every time democracy has expanded, to include women, to include people without property, to include racial and ethnic minorities who had been excluded, it has become more legitimate, more representative, and more durable. Exclusion, however rationalized, creates resentment and instability. Information is power, and its quality matters enormously. A democracy whose citizens are systematically misinformed will make systematically bad decisions. The work of seeking accurate information, of supporting the institutions that produce and distribute it, of developing the critical thinking skills to evaluate it, is not just an individual intellectual virtue. It is a civic responsibility. No political system is perfect, and no political victory is final. The pursuit of a more just, more free, more equal society is a permanent project. It will never be finished. Every generation inherits it and passes it on. Part 24. The Last Word. You have now traveled from the earliest human settlements, where politics began as the question of who controls the grain store, to the present moment, where the same fundamental question, who decides, is being asked and contested in new forms, through new technologies, against a backdrop of new and frightening challenges. You have seen that the history of politics is not a story of steady progress toward a predetermined destination. It is a story of struggle, of loss and recovery, of genuine moral progress and terrible regressions, of ideas that seemed impossible becoming reality, and of achievements that seemed permanent being dismantled. It is a human story, in all its complexity and contradiction. What does it mean to understand politics? It means knowing that the world as it is was not inevitable. It was made by human choices, by political struggles, won and lost, by the accumulated decisions of millions of people across time. And because it was made, it can be remade. It means understanding that the people who tell you that nothing can change, that the way things are is the way things must be, that power belongs to those who have it and always will, are either mistaken about history or serving an interest in making you believe that. It means taking seriously the responsibility that comes with living in a society where you have a voice. Not every political system gives its people that voice. Billions of human beings throughout history have lived and died without it. The people who have it and do not use it are squandering something that was paid for at an extraordinary price. And finally, it means holding on to the understanding that politics, at its best, is not about power for its own sake. It is about the ancient, ongoing, imperfect, essential human project of figuring out how to live together, how to share a world, how to make decisions that are fair enough and inclusive enough that people can accept them without feeling that their humanity has been denied. That project has no ending. It is the work of every generation. And now, having understood where it came from and where it stands, it is yours.